So Yazid, we're just gonna ask you some open-ended questions and give you an opportunity to share what you want to share with us. And then we'll do a question round so everyone can ask you their burning questions, and we'll kind of collect them. And then at the end, we'll pass it back to you to answer them, if that works for you. So fantastic. So in your experience, you know where we are. We've been, in touch, and we've been grateful to have your consultation about where we are. And we've just finished drafting the strategic plan, and we are pivoting to implementation. And we're really eager to have your experience of the key drivers of effective, successful implementation of whole school RJE. And we're wanting you to sort of walk us through the process of what you did with SchoolTalk DC, what that looks like, and, generally what you want us to know about that. So thank you.
Yeah, really, really good question. What we've been able to do here while I've been at, SchoolTalk, Restorative DC, when I was in Philadelphia and Houston and some other places, Oakland, Chicago, what we've been able to do is really, really focus on implementation science. And what myself and my team really likes to stress is, don't focus on really making and creating like really fancy documents that live on a shelf. How do you create documents that actually live in real life? And what are the evidence of those documents living? Like show artifacts that those documents are actually living. Another key part that we're really diving into now, and that we dove into, in previous years, but really focusing on now is resource mapping. It's really how can restorative justice really latch on to key initiatives and goals that are already existing in the school, and really letting staff members know, the community know, that restorative justice and restorative practices is not an isolated practice that stands alone. What we actually ask our schools is to really, give us 3 to 5, goals or initiatives that you have in your school. Give us 3 key partnerships that you may have in your school. And that way we can provide capacity building within those key goals or those key initiatives and programming. That way it can live and have a place that's going to be steady within that school community. And then that way you can branch off, build capacity, build confidence, skill building, and really begin to sustain, not just build, but sustain the overall culture as you build individuals' capacity. And so what typically happens in a lot of schools is, you send a couple people to a training, you'd be like, hey, you're responsible to bring this work back. And if you don't bring this work back, the trainer probably sucked. That's not reality, because this is more than just a circle. And what we really dive into is, restorative circles is a practice of restorative justice, not the totality of what restorative justice actually is. So really latching on to existing goals will allow restorative justice to really have a place in implementation and branch off to its own specific and targeted goals, where data could be developed and resources can be developed to create data-informed decisions and ways to pivot, revise, and edit your implementation plan.
All of that is great. Say more.
Um, and what I would really say with the resource mapping is, like, the resource mapping is what we've learned about restorative justice and about school implementation is schools really have a difficult time planning. Planning is not fun. Planning is intense. Planning is an ongoing process.
Yazid, I think you froze a little.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Sorry. I left off with planning. So planning is a part of the work that a lot of people do not desire to do because it's ongoing. It's an ongoing practice. And when you're creating your implementation plan is essentially the skeleton, but your implementation plan has to constantly be revisited. It is not a fancy document that you create in July when all of your teachers are on break, just with the leadership team, and then you pass it off to, other people, and you say, hey, implement this thing. That's not proper implementation science. That's not how things kind of transition and that are fluid throughout your school. But resource mapping has been really a key part in diving into the work and understanding why we have the initiatives that we have and what are really the targeted goals. And what it really does is gives the school community the ability to understand how the school is functioning and what is the plan moving forward throughout the year and years to come. And so we look at resource mapping, we're looking at least 3 years of data. We're looking at 3 years of what is your trajectory of your demographics. Does your staff population meet the need of the student population? Is your staff population prepared to support the demographics that is coming? And it's not just like when we talk about demographics, we're not just talking about like race and diversity, which are key elements, but we're actually talking about influx in, 6th grade students. Do you have the staff to actually do this practice with fidelity? How many new staff members are you bringing on? What is the retention rate? How many staff members are transitioning per year? Why? How do we onboard new staff members so they can support the current culture that's being upheld? And so these are the intricate pieces. Like, is there a new staff advisory where we have, an exemplary staff member or members kind of walking with the new staff members to bring them on board as they transition into a new school, and understanding like the ethics, the code, the overall culture of the school and of the students. Do your staff members actually know who the students are? Do we know our audience? How do we pivot when our audience is not what we think they are? But that resource mapping piece really allows us to constantly dig in to the work, because that's an ongoing tedious process that we need to constantly revisit, and making sure that all stakeholders understand what the goals are moving forward. And also understanding the barriers that come with that. So when we talk about planning, we're not talking about best case scenario. We're talking about best, worst, and in the middle. And are we preparing? Are we giving our staff members the toolkit so that they can be successful, so that they can carry that piece on to the student population? And so when we think about restorative justice, sometimes we're thinking about it as a student-facing practice. We have to do this with the students. Most of the times, in my experience, staff members actually have more issues than the students. So how do we support the adult culture? What does staff engagement look like? Do we actually have staff engagement goals? Not showing up to meetings, and also being able to separate token versus implementation. Like, am I doing this thing so I can get highly effective, or am I doing this to really support the school culture? And how do we differentiate the two, or the 3 or the 4, depending on the district or the school culture? But really creating that buy-in that's out of joy, love, and compassion versus autonomy, hierarchy, and things of that nature. And so resource mapping has been a really key element that has driven our work, and the work that has been done over the years, with understanding your school. And what we really come to realize, most people, including principals, do not understand their school. And resource mapping really allows us to really figure out what our realistic goals, what our realistic restorative justice goals for our schools, and not having these San Francisco goals that are not connected with our population that we serve.
Yeah, can you tell us more about what the resource mapping that you've done actually looks like? And don't feel any kind of way about getting into the weeds. I think we're sort of in the point where we're eager to get into the weeds and hear, like, specifically, what does that look like?
Yeah, so in our schools in DC, like public charter schools and DCPS schools that we support, they have like two different platforms on their initial goals. So DCPS, DC Public Schools, has a comprehensive school plan. And the comprehensive school plan may have particular elements that are driven by the district. And public charter schools may have a school improvement plan. And so in those pieces are probably going to have some portion of ELA or literacy, some type of math or STEM goal, and some level of engagement, SEL, attendance, behavior, kind of grouped into one. And so what we tend to do is, all right, we look at what partnerships do you have to support this goal? So when we're talking about attendance, you may have attendance counselors, you may have social workers, you may have school counselors that might drive attendance. So making phone calls home, you might have dean of students making phone calls home, home visits, etc. Pre-COVID. You may look at literacy. You may have an instructional coach. You may have an assistant principal. You may have a LEAP lead. You may have that core personnel. And then you'll look at what are the supporting agencies to support with that. So it might be City Year. There might be other extracurricular or post-school activities to support it. You might have a reading specialist. Going to the SEL, you might have a psychologist or a DBH clinician to support the SEL work. But how does all of, and do we actually know what every piece of the puzzle does? And do we understand their either department or agency goals? And so we lay that out. So if I'm a DBH clinician, I don't support students with special ed. If I am a social worker, I deal with students that may be. If I'm a school counselor, I may not deal with students that may have a BIP or that may have a BIP, but I don't work directly with students that have an IEP. So how does all of those pieces work together? And where is the line of communication? How do we meet? How do we stream our teams? How frequently do our teams meet? Which teams should meet with each other? How do we cross-pollinate? How do I share literacy with SEL, attendance, and behavior? What is the frequency of our meetings? Is it oversaturated? And then how do we find people that are on multiple teams to be able to share that information so we're not creating another meeting? So it's more than just let's figure out the goals. It's about human capacity as well. Like, are we staffing these teams appropriately so we don't create additional teams? How do we create teams to where we can cross-pollinate and have a person that's on the literacy team that might be on the SEL team or the behavior team? How do we have the psychologist on the literacy team? So then that way there's clear cohesion in the team so that we can share information. We understand, like, working in the school, and especially virtually, we oftentimes work in silos. And so we only share information with the people that are directly impacted by the work. but how do we organize team structures so that it's ongoing learning, growth, and shared information. And that's really been key for us, is to really create and support with, revising some of these teams so we're not recreating the wheel. An example is if we have a care team that consists of teachers, social workers, counselors, dean of students, and in the leadership, a member of the leadership team, we actually want to keep that team. But how do we adjust our agenda to make sure that we meet the needs? How do we fill in the blanks with literacy and math so that they can support better? Me as a dean of students, which I'm not, but I used to be, but if I was a dean of students, how can I support in the classroom outside of behavior? Because the behavior that we see is not defiance. It could be academic. So how do we differentiate academic behavior versus trauma? And how do we know the difference? And what's the evidence? And how do we present the evidence to prove otherwise? And then we might get into like RTI, response to intervention, MTSS, multi-tier systems of support, PBIS. You might be getting into those systems, but how does students and how does the team kind of introduce themselves to those systems prior? And what is the actual plan to get a student from a tier 1 to a tier 2 in the MTSS model? But that team structure will allow us to have fidelity in our practice, to move a student forward and move our school in a way that really sustains the practices that we really want to uphold. Did I say enough?
Yeah, that was really wonderful. I do have a request around the abbreviations.
Oh, yes.
We have a lot of APS folks on the call, but we also have community members, students, parents, so I'm not sure everyone knows what an IEP is or what SEL is. So
Sorry.
out of an abundance of clarity, and also we have folks who might be watching this later who might want those things clarified. So no judgment.
No. That, like, when I transitioned to DC, I realized that they were very acronym heavy. In order to hold a conversation, you had to like understand the acronyms of the DC jargon. So IEP, individualized education plan for students that may be in need of additional supports, academically, socially, behavior, SEL, social emotional learning that has key competencies in self-exploration, self-reflection, decision-making, self-awareness, those areas. In PBIS, positive behavior intervention supports, MTSS, multi-tier systems of support, which is a framework to support students in the overall school, which consists of 3 tiers of support: tier 3, tier 2, tier 1, all, some, few. Did I miss any?
BIP.
Behavior intervention plan. BIP is a behavior intervention plan that may be in support of students who have exhibited behavior challenges or supports. Anybody else can jump in if I missed anything.
No, thank you, Yazid. I'm wondering if there is anything else specific that you just want us to know, or if you'd like to throw around a question round and get in, because I feel like we might have an abundance of questions.
And the one thing I'll say about restorative justice implementation, it takes time, but it doesn't take time. It takes time and years. It takes intentionality. And so when people say I don't have the time, that means we're not being intentional about the work. And I always say, well, how much time do you give a kid in crisis? As much time needed to de-escalate. That's as much time as you need to implement restorative justice. And so a student in crisis is sometimes abrupt, sometimes during a fire drill, sometimes during an evaluation. And your job is to de-escalate in a way that student is neutral, so you can have a practical dialogue. So when we talk about how much time does restorative justice takes, it requires enough time and space in order to neutralize your school and your community. And so you put in adequate time in order to get to that goal. And barring, we have barriers, we have other initiatives, we have other priorities, but really making sure that we have intentional time, not just circles. Circles are cute and they're fun and they're lively, and it's great to see and it's great to illustrate, and it's great to see a student say, have an aha moment, but that requires the planning piece. That requires a holistic understanding of the work. And those things are great, and I don't take anything away from that, but I really drive people to and challenge people. Restorative justice is not just a circle, because what happens if the circle is screwed up? Then what do? Most people say restorative justice doesn't work. So people judge RJ based off of the success of the circle, and that's not the reality of the process. The process is we keep coming back until it works, and then you keep working the process until it continues to work. And so a circle process is one major element, but it's not all of the work. And really driving people to understand that, like, oh, I'm doing RJ implementation. We have check-in circles. Oh, okay, that's cool. But your check-in circles did what? Like, give me, did your check-in circles increase attendance? Did your check-in circles increase on-time arrival? Did your check-in circles increase to higher performance? So don't talk to me about check-in circles. I'm sorry. I don't mean to bust your bubble, but give me the evidence on what check-in circles did beyond you checking in. And what is your plan? Because check-in circles are going to go, but so far, what are you going to do year 2? You want to keep doing check-in circles? So when you don't have a plan to how to expand the practice, you get stuck on the basics. And then when the basics run out, you don't have the advanced practice because you haven't built the capacity of the staff members. So the question I will actually pose to you all is, like, what has been your biggest challenge with implementation? I'm seeing faces.
Are you
Ask that question back.
an answer from the whole circle, or from Leanne, or from
popcorn? Let's popcorn it out. Let's popcorn it out.
Well, I guess I'd like to share that we haven't quite started doing much in the way of implementation. And I'm not sure that we do have a few schools that are doing some implementation, but those schools aren't really represented in this working group right now. So I could get you some answers to that, but maybe not from this particular group of lovely people.
Yeah. So what do you, I'll reword the question. What do you foresee your barriers being of implementation when you are in position to implement some of the practices that you are aware of at this point?
So we're accustomed to speaking in our speaking order. So I'd like to invite everyone to just honor Yazid's request to, like, popcorn it out, which is a term for just sort of speaking as the spirit moves you to speak. So yeah.
Sorry, I got it.
Oh, no, it's okay. We can be flexible.
I'll share something. Okay, So we're really new in this, admittedly very, very new in this. And I happen to work in a new school as well. So we're establishing culture and climate overall in our school in general, because it's a new school. So then looking at restorative practices is a layer of that, right? So establishing culture and climate, and then how to look at RJ practices as a part of that, right? So what are some of the challenges I see? Well, we're a new school that opened in a pandemic practically. So establishing culture and climate, we had about 6 months to do that, and then we were working online. So that's a little tough. That's one obstacle. I think another obstacle is when we want to do a new initiative is the fiscal piece of it, right? Like you want to do something, but then you also need to have the personnel to help with that as well, and lead the work. So those are the first two things that came to mind.
No, that's really key. We have a principal that restructured her hiring practices to make sure that folks that she hired were willing to take part in training, because this was going to be the pillar in her school culture. Even the questions that she asked on her interview process, with even putting on the application, how many years of restorative justice experience do you have? What is your level of awareness of RJ, so that she can make sure that she's bringing in the people that will embrace the culture, not necessarily having 10 plus years of experience, but the willingness to embrace the culture was really important. And when you talk about personnel, like, do I have the right personnel to fit where we're trying to go, and how do I kind of develop that on the go, as we're building this plane while we're flying it, is a really important piece in developing the practice, but also developing the capacity. And looking at capacity is not like we're stronger in numbers, but thinking about information. Are we stronger in information? Are we strong in information sharing? Do we have the right people that will embrace this work? Do they have a natural restorative mindset? How do I ask questions that really get at that level, so that we can make the proper decisions when we come to that, in staff decision making. So that's really key. It's really not just about, all right, once we get in the building, all right, everybody's going to have a restorative mindset. That's not true, because you have to equate culture. You have to equate age, years of experience. If you have a person, individual that's teaching. I had an experience where I was new to a school in DC, and I'm bringing RJ, and I have this senior teacher. He's been teaching at the school that I was at for 42 years. And I'm like, I'm intimidated. I'm like, how do I, he's been doing it his way. He's been highly successful. Like, I'm just, I'm at that time 32. Like, what can I give him that, he's been teaching longer than I've been alive. And when he embraced the practice, and when it changed his trajectory of teaching and engaging, I was like blown away. I mean, he's now retired in a part of the Board of Education that's doing really great work, and supporting the RJ work, in his district. But these are things that we have to face. When you have, newer teachers and, tenured teachers, like what is that, middle ground in teaching and exploring restorative justice. And so staffing is definitely a key part of that work that cannot be ignored.
I will add, I think Arlington Public School, there's a lot of interest in ensuring that this is system-wide implementation. And so with any, and I don't want to say an initiative, but when we begin to do something new within any school system, there's always that fear and concern of this is another initiative. And so I think it's important, and in terms of what you were saying, that it's important to build it into some of the work that's happening. And so when we think of the work that we're doing around equity, MTSS, and social and emotional learning, connecting it to that and adding that piece of what's that restorative mindset. So again, I think from the onset, we have to share that, because if we don't share that, then I can see the concerns that will happen and some of the barriers. So that's one area. And then the other piece is a lot of times, many school systems, when you see something that has a lot of merit based on research, and we try to implement it, a lot of times we focus on doing things. And just like you mentioned in terms of circles and let's do this and let's do that. And it's important to really, from the onset, or it could be a barrier is to really talk about the restorative mindset and to do the planning and to ensure that we're not working in silos. And so, you know, we're working very hard with our discipline committee and ensuring that we are having dialogue about academics and all of the other variables that contribute to outcomes. So I kind of see it from the lens of like anything that's new or discussed, whether it's about academics, restorative practices, those two pieces can prevent us from moving in the direction that we really want to go in. So I would just add that.
You guys are knocking out the park. You guys are doing the work with your questions. And we talk about communication, right? Like, so we talk about staff engagement. We can't talk about like staff attending meetings, staff attending activities. So staff engagement is how do we communicate to staff members, and what has been the proven best way to communicate new information. So do we do it in June before we go on break? Do we bring on new initiatives in July? Do we present it in pre-service week, which is bad idea. Don't do it. They won't receive it. So how do we bring on new initiatives and what I would say is supplemental frameworks that support other frameworks that you already have existing? And so resource mapping actually gives you like the columns. Who is this work targeted for? Who's responsible for it? Who's monitoring the plan? Who's creating the plan? Who's revising the plan? And what committee is responsible for the plan? Now, and does all stakeholders know who those people are and how to provide feedback? And a staff meeting telling staff what they're going to do isn't probably the best communication. And so how do we revise our staff meetings? And do we have less staff meetings? And maybe we email our staff meetings and have more discussion around initiatives, and then email upcoming events and due dates and newsletters and data reports. So what do we communicate verbally? And then what do we actually use a restorative circle to problem solve so we can understand what is the best way to provide information to the staff? And so we can actually use the practice in a way that, in my experience, that have worked really well is providing the experience and then naming the experience later. Because if you name it first, people are like, no, I don't. I'm initiative fatigue. Don't tell me another thing I got to do, because in my head, that means more work. I need to learn a new skill. That means I need to lose part of my identity. And I'm not willing to sacrifice that for something that's going to go when you get another job. Because you're the school leader and you'll probably go faster than an initiative that you're bringing. And I've been here 3 years before you was here. So you're going to go before I'm going to go. So you can take that initiative with you in haul ass. I mean, that's kind of what happened in my experience.
Yeah. Thank you so much. I'm wondering if anyone else has an answer for Yazid's challenge before we throw around a question round. All right. So what I'd love to do, Yazid, is to skip you and pass to Alita for any additional questions. And I'd love to just collect them if it's all right, and then have you answer at the end. I'm happy to sort of take notes if that's helpful, or you can collect them, whatever works for you.
I'm completely flexible. How you guys have been operating, I will adjust accordingly.
Thank you for your flexibility and your presence. I want everyone to feel free to pass if you don't have a question, or if someone has already asked your question. I will try and type your questions into the chat to collect them. And when we get back to Yazid, then we can see if we can get his brilliance to answer all the questions. So Alita, I pass to you with integrity.
I think I'm trying to think what my question is, but when I think of the focus of Arlington Public School in terms of the goal of ensuring that we are diverse and equitable and inclusive school system, and I think about restorative practices. And so my question to you in terms of the cultural proficiency or the cultural competency that's required to implement restorative practices that, you know, are equitable, what are some of the recommendations that you have around restorative justice, and how it's tied into ensuring that we are meeting the needs of the entire student population, and our own practices and what we do in our own cultural competency?
Yeah, I mean, you just answered that question. Explore it with the adult population first. Like, how do we define diversity? Is it just having Black and brown and white students? Is it, sexual orientation? Is it gender? Like, what does diversity actually mean? What does equity mean? And how do we really define these things so it can really live? And when school districts have like initiatives of like equity, diversity, and inclusion, a lot of the times, school staff, we really don't take the time to really dive into those terms. It's expected that we know them and that, we should execute those things with mastery, and really having a practice that dives into, that really defines and redefines those terms for our school community is really important. You might have a diverse practice, but have 80% Caucasian students. So where does diversity live there? You may have, in DC, we have some schools that are 95% African-American. So where does diversity live there? Where does inclusion live there? And so how do we actually name these things and then define our actual demographics to see how can we plug these things in to make sure that we're providing equitable practice inside the classroom, within the community, and then what's needed for the adults to be able to execute the practices with fidelity. And that's ongoing skill development. And that's not a pre-service 1 hour or 2 hour PD and say, okay, you know, it's a check mark. Me and my teammates did a race, equity, and inclusion training sometime in August, and the school actually wanted us to provide them with the answers, but the answers actually lies into your own exploration. Like, I'm not responsible for your own work because I don't know your story. And so how do we create a culture where we allow people to present who they are, and how do we allow them to explore with the community and independently? And so we actually did with that particular school is each person had a race, equity, and inclusion plan that actually fed into the plan that we developed with the leadership team. And so we have to do our own work in order for this to actually be relevant. And there's not an assumption because, you know, we have 120 credits in this and, you know, a master's in that we actually understand this work, because our cultural and lived experiences impact our views. And we're not trying to necessarily heal everyone and come to this like utopian thought, but how do we get people closer? And how do we create a culture to get people closer, you know, to that? And I think that's really important. Like, before we do anything student facing, we have to do the adult facing work. We can't skip that process. Go ahead.
So you do that work with restorative justice? That's what I was wondering. Is it?
Yeah. We don't present anything to students unless we've did the crunching with the adults. Like, we don't bypass the adults and then say, students, be reflective. No, you be reflective. Don't tell me to be reflective. I'm 11. Your 40-year-old self, be reflective in your practices. And really, like, that's what we need to be, because we ask students to do things that we're not capable of. We ask 12-year-olds to reflect in a manner that we cringe to do. Like, we actually cringe to reflect on the actions, like were they biased? Was it because I just had a bad day? And then we ask, you know, Johnny, which is like a popular name when you're giving examples, like, why did you do that? Like, why did you do that? Like, why are you off task? Your lesson sucks. I'm off task because I'm bored. Like, how about you spice your lesson up? Like, are teachers really ready to receive that? The answer is no. But we want students to receive the harsh feedback when they're not on task. And so how do we create an adult culture that we can be constantly reflective? And that's how we increase overall accountability in our practice. And so if accountability is going to be a pillar in our practice, we can't skip the adults. We actually have to go to the adults first, because they are the stronghold and they are the leaders of the work, so they can model it. We can't ask students to do something that hasn't been modeled for them. And that's really important.
Thank you so much. Thanks.
Yasmina, are you passing to, welcome Yasmina. Alita, are you passing to Sabrina?
With deep listening, I pass to Sabrina.
I think I'm just like processing a lot right now, because like a lot of stuff going on. My question was kind of like, you talked about how the plans are always changing. You can't create one definite plan. And like, I was just wondering, how do you go about doing that? Like, creating cooperation to like continuously change that plan and make it so you end up like creating those successes that you want.
Yeah, so the implementation plan is very intricate in terms of the details. Like, my team right now, They have deadlines that's October 30th to evaluate and understand all data sources. They're like, Yazid, like, why would you have me do that? I want to come in and do programming and really understand the difference between programming and capacity building. The plan, and especially right now, is very evident because, you know, for us, and I'm pretty sure for you all in other parts of the country, looking at, you know, after November 6th, 9th, 3rd, whatever the case may be, going into a hybrid model. So how does the practice differ going from all virtual to hybrid? How do we support students? Which population of students will actually be in the building? Which population of students will be out of the building? How can we, and we talk about equity, I'm going to Alita's point, like how can I provide equitable practices and make sure I'm giving support and services to the students that are coming into the building and students that are still learning virtual, because that's equity. So if I'm talking about providing equitable practices, how do I differentiate my practices between solely virtual learners and hybrid learners? And then also, what skills does my teachers need to have in order to execute these practices? So when I go back to my plan, I say, okay, new information, y'all. You know, however it may go, 5th grade teachers, we are going to actually do circle keeping training with you all. 6th and 7th grade teachers, we're going to really focus on virtual circle keeping. Now we're going to make sure 6th grade has in-person circle keeping. Now, how do we do that with social distancing? How do I create a talking piece? Well, do we suspend the talking piece? So like all of these different details, make sure that is outlined there. And then now virtual. How do I create a virtual circle? Like you guys have done with the illustration and a diagram and the speaking order, things like that. How do I norm that with my 7th and 8th grade teachers? Now, because I'm pretty sure 6th grade is going first, 7th grade may come, you know, after 2nd semester. How do I scaffold the learning? So how do I scaffold 6th grade primarily hybrid, 7th grade virtual, 8th grade virtual, but I know at some point all students are going to go back before the end of the year. So how do I scaffold the training to make sure I'm not bombarding staff members to a point where they're burnt out and they're saying, you're giving me too much. But how do I present them and say, hey, we're going to focus on this. We're going to come to you by this date. We're going to have our first 1 hour, introduction. We're going to have a 2-hour PD. We're going to have an hour of coaching. We're going to have another hour of skill building. And then by the time that you all are being called to do hybrid, you are now comfortable with the skills that have been developed. And so like that's a small example of continuously updating the plan. And the plan isn't just like the skeleton. So a lot of times the planning is like, all right, we're going to have these goals. This is what we're going to do. But we don't account for like all the BS that comes with it, right? Like I just lost a math teacher. My ELA teacher, my key ELA teacher is on maternity leave. I have a long-term sub. Like all of these pieces that impact implementation, like how do I take all those things into account and make sure that I'm revising the plan to meet the current need, not the need in July. The need in July was utopia. And those plans usually don't work, which is why January, most schools say we're gonna have a reset plan. No, you don't really actually need a reset plan. Your original plan actually sucked. The reset plan is the new plan. So how do we execute one plan that transitions throughout the year that is fluid? So you should never go through a school year having a reset plan if you haven't executed the original plan. And so that's why the planning process should be ongoing and fluid. And I've created many of plans that sucked. So I'm not pointing people out. I had to learn the hard way.
Thank you, Z. Sabrina, was that all? Or are you ready to pass?
Yeah, that was it. But so I'll pass it to Zakia with trust.
Zakia, are you back? I think Zakia stepped away for a minute. Why
I'll
don't
pass
we
this to
go ahead and
Jen.
pass to Jen?
Yeah.
Thank you.
All right, my question would be, what are some of the hurdles or barriers or issues that you've had throughout your career, and how were they solved, or did you just have to, rely on other people or change your plan, like you said, or remap things would be my question.
The biggest challenge has been kind of Alita alluded to, is really that adult culture. I mean, students will buy in when it's clear, when it's evident, when all teachers are going to do it. Students know when certain teachers are going to do it, and like I give a hat example, right? Like hats are not to be worn in the classroom, or hoods. But we know the teachers that are like, you know what? I'm just happy you're here. Like, you're here, you're ready to learn, you're participating, you're engaged. And it kind of goes back to that social discipline window. We're not going to get into it right now. But adult culture has been the hardest because you're dealing with human beings. And this is humanity work. And the tricky part about humanity work is you're dealing with a lot. And you're dealing with adult trauma. You're dealing with adults that haven't dealt with childhood trauma. You're dealing with past experiences. You're dealing with new versus old. You're dealing with cultural. You're dealing with a lot. And what I've done in the past that has been successful is I've dedicated myself to the staff. Me personally, in my practice, I don't focus on students. The students will never get the fruit of the labor unless the adults are taken care of, cared for, loved, coached, held accountable. And so what I've done in the past, which is literally still going on to this day, I started a 6 a.m. workout class where staff members came in before work and we worked out. And that was, even though it was like a very small thing, it started off with like 5 people. It ended up being like 25 people that showed up to work at 6 a.m. that worked out for an hour. And what that did was that built on-time arrival, that built alertness, that built engagement, that built problem-solving skills. It built, you can see your colleagues, how they deal with challenges with the workout. That transition to trust, partner workouts, group workouts, having fun. Like, this work is already hard. Like how do we bring fun and engagement? And so like, how do we have monthly activities that's really for staff where we don't talk about students and the troubles, really building that staff trust. So when I speak, they listen. Like, that was the key. Like, when I speak, you listen. Not when I speak, I'm right. When I speak, you challenge. When I speak, you question. When I speak, you spark curiosity. Asking questions actually lead to more learning. So I can only speak from my experiences. I can't speak from yours. And I can't speak from your challenges or your barriers. But what I can do is present a question to make us all wonder, so that we could all come together to create a plan that is equitable, which is all voices heard, that we can actually, like, that's practical. Like, are we actually willing to do this thing that we said we're going to do? And if the majority says no, then it's probably a no. Like, it's probably going to be a no. Like, if the majority say, you know what, I'm not really with it, your authority in your position doesn't supersede their actions. So if I'm the principal and I say, no, we're going to do this, and 75% in the survey said no, it's going to be no. They're not going to do it. So, like, how do we break those barriers of sex, gender, and power to really create a culture of inclusivity? And some of those non-work things really drove it. And when I worked in Houston, like I was doing school turnaround for like 7 years, and I had like the lovely job. I don't know why I took this job on, but to go into like the top 50 most dangerous schools in the country and like turn those schools around into compliant schools. So went to Beechwood Academy in Houston, huge gang population. They could not retain teachers. We came in, started to support, and they're like, what are we going to do? And I'm like, have fun. They're like, we can't have fun. We got gang members. I'm like, so what? Gang members can have fun. What you think they do on their weekends? Like, you think they're just stiffs? Like, they're coming to school for a reason. So there's something that you guys are providing that they're enjoying. And so how do we bridge that gap so that you guys can have fun as a staff and the students can have fun? And when we built that, like, we didn't have gang issues. Like they might have had gang affiliation outside of school, but we really decreased the gang activity within the school because the students really wanted engagement, which is why they're in the gang. I want engagement. Engage me. But we had to engage in the adults in order to engage the students. So really not coming from that, like, do as I say, this is what we're going to do, but how do I really look at creating trust without doing it in the confines of a staff meeting? Staff meetings don't provide trust. It's just information sharing. And so how do I do it informally? Just like our students, we don't provide trust with a student by giving them an assessment. Like, we provide it by doing engaging activities, informal conversations, restorative dialogue, things like that. We have to do the same thing with our adult population. That way it can trickle down to the student population. So the adult culture has always, still is, been the most difficult part of this work because you're dealing with so many like fixed mindsets.
Thanks, Yazid. So I'm noticing that it is our break time. So I'd like to just sort of ask the group if we still have 7 people in our speaking order that we haven't gotten to. Do you want to quickly try and like share your questions? And then, wait, Yazid, are you planning to stay for the rest of the conversation, or are you out at 8?
You guys let me know what you need.
I think we would love to have you answer as many questions as you have time to answer. Do you, you know, I know it's a long time. Remember if we discussed it before, if you would be staying for like the whole meeting, or if you were.
I'm good. We're here.
Great.
Guys, let me know what you want.
Verbal agreements are binding in the Commonwealth of Virginia.
I am learning. I do appreciate that you all are stating virtues as you pass the talking piece. That's a good norm.
Thank you.
I learned that today. That's pretty. I like that. I like that a lot.
So what I would love to do is, because I'm concerned about time and taking a break, can everyone just type your question into the chat? And then maybe we can take a break, and when we come back, Yazid can answer them in whatever order makes sense for him. Does that work for everyone? Can you give me a thumbs up if that works for you? Okay, great. So what I would say is go ahead and type your question into the chat. We'll take our 10-minute break, and then when we come back, Yazid will continue sharing from his wisdom.
8:10.
8:10.
Or 8:08.
Let's say 8:10. Make it a nice round number.
Okay, I just have to get a 9-year-old in the shower. So.
Oh. Go team.
Go team.
In the chat. Lydia asked, what drove you to this work? Leanne asked, you mentioned people saying in a survey that they won't do it. Is a survey part of your resource mapping process to see if a school is ready for RJ? And also in an earlier conversation, you mentioned focusing on the people who are skeptical more than those who are gung-ho about RJ. Please say more about that. Bedtime. My 7-year-old is against it. I asked about how whole school RJ implementation looked in a responsive classroom school. And Steve asked about internal challenges implementing RJ as a new practice and getting buy-in from staff, and successful strategies to educate the external stakeholders to the benefits of RJ practices in the school system. So whatever order makes sense to you, Yazid. I do want to note that we did want to have a round where we are talking about sort of internally what we're doing in APS before we check out. So maybe if we could try and spend like another 20 minutes so we can get that round in.
So I answered the first one from Lydia. What drove me to this work? I literally, I had no desire to be an educator, like by any stretch. I thought I hated kids. I wasn't the most compliant student or child. I was like Dennis the Menace. I found ways to push people's buttons to get a reaction from them. I was intrigued by their response to me. It allowed me to like understand a little bit deeper about them than my actions. I don't know if that's like cruel or what, but like, so as I like got a little bit older and I was in high school, I was a pretty popular athlete in New Jersey. I think I left high school probably like 37 full ride scholarships. And I ended up going to college, and I remember having my first African-American male teacher, Anthropology 101. And I'm like, oh my God, I've been missing this my whole life. Like, it was my first experience with the African-American male teacher. And I never had it. I've seen it on TV, but I've never experienced an African-American male teacher. And like, I literally like almost cried when I saw him in person, like you're actually real, like it's actually possible. And I was so intrigued in his class, and for a class anthropology, like nobody really wants to take that class. And I was intrigued by him, not what he was necessarily teaching. And it clicked to me, like that was my first like indicator that education might be something for me, because I wanted to be something that I've never seen before. Like my path, honestly, not my own, trust me, not my own path at all, because I would have carved it a whole lot differently. But I think what I'm developing to be is a person that I didn't see in school. And people, like my friends, we've never seen, a Black young educator that was relevant. And so that's what I really aspired to be when I got the privilege. So I don't take my position for granted. I embrace it in a way that that is of service. Yeah, that's literally how I got here. Like, I changed my major. I was a kinesiology major. I thought I wanted to work with professional athletes and do like PT and sports training, which I had the opportunity to do. It's a good skill of mine, but my passion is really to developing students that look like me, that may not have had the opportunity to experience the same experience as their other counterparts. So that's really drove me to the work, and that's what keeps me here with all the challenges that it does present. I'm trying to show them that it's possible and you don't have to look a certain way, which is why I have a beard. I won't cut it until I see my students become educators, because I'm not trying to fit a status quo of anybody. And I'm showing them, like, I wear sneakers to work every day, just about every day. But I'm me, I'm not going to change that and compromise that, because me being me is letting them be them. And so that's what drove me here, and that's what's keeping me here.
Bravo. Thank you.
Let me go back through the chat. Two questions were kind of similar. Kamiko, I kind of answer your question. How does whole school RJ look in a responsive classroom school? So you're talking about like the initiative, like the responsive classroom, like the programming? It's really aligned in the practices. And the resource mapping will allow you I don't even think resource mapping is like a program, but if it was, I'm not like selling the commercial, but resource mapping will allow you to align those practices. Like, how does, SEL and RJ work together? How does responsive classroom, conscious classroom, turnaround for children work with restorative justice? Most of those programs are really rooted in restorative practices. And we won't know, like if I'm a teacher and you're saying, well, RJ and response, that's too much for me to do in one and curriculum. But when you do the resource mapping and you look and you create diagrams of alignment, you're not doing a bunch of different things. You're actually doing more of the same. And so that resource mapping is really crucial so that your staff can actually see the alignment, so that you can really have targeted goals and systems that will be supported by the programming. And that's really important. And responsive classroom, RJ has a responsive, on a continuum, there's responsive practices, and all you are doing is like blending responsive classroom with the responsive practices. And some of them may look very similar. There might be some, details that may be more targeted in restorative justice and or restorative practices, but it's really important that as a school leader that we align the programming with other existing and supplemental frameworks, so that as a teacher, I'm not looking like, hey, I have to teach ELA and responsive classroom and SEL and PB. Like, you got me doing too much. But they're all rooted in some of the foundations. And if we look at the foundations of the practices, we can actually find the commonalities, which is why I said you shouldn't present things to staff members during pre-service week, because it's really too much to process. And these things should really happen like, in April, April, when budget comes out and things like that. That's the time that you should really be introducing new initiatives that you really want to have a vision for throughout the year. And I know testing, kind of gets in the way of that, but you really have to prioritize, like, what is it that you're going to prioritize as you move forward? Because, teachers are off July, August when you're doing your planning. And so you're having key personnel not present when you're doing your planning, which is not an inclusive practice. So, I want to beat a dead horse. I don't know if that's like an appropriate term at this point, but like, I don't want to belabor a point. Let me use proper jargon.
Thank you.
Oh, let me go to the chat again. Steve, you spoke about some of the internal challenges doing new practices, getting by some successful strategies to educate the external. Steve, I have a question. Can you identify what the external stakeholders, like, who would they be?
Just looking outward, like parents, you know,
Okay.
members of the community, you know, as they're trying to wrap their heads around what this new environment is for the schools, like what were good ways to, you know, put that out outside of the school environment to.
Got you. So what we were able to do, and what we hosted in some of our schools were like family engagement activities, like as you're doing enrollment. I'm not sure how Arlington schools work with enrollment, but I know in DC and other places in the country, like enrollment is a pretty big deal in terms of getting families to enroll their students on a year-by-year basis. And so what we're able to do is really hold partnership fairs and resource fairs. And honestly, my last year that I worked in a school, we did a resource fair with the staff, and then we did it with the families. And it was really key for the staff because the staff didn't know all of the resources that were actually in the school. And the last school I was in, we had like 23 external partners, not including families. And so if I am a female student that is pregnant, who do I go to? If I'm a male student that is expecting, who do I go to? If I'm having behavior challenges or challenges at home, and I'm a parent, and I'm supporting a student that has behavior challenges at home, but not in school, where do I find support? And so what we really did, we did a resource fair, and that really allowed us to really create a system to where we understood all of the partnerships and the supporters of the community. And then now we were able to create systems so that teachers, parents knew where to go to as we're developing RJ within all of those pieces. And going back to the resource mapping again, and that's how we've been able to kind of tell a story and have parents actually participate in Circle when they didn't even really know what they were actually doing, and then we named it later. Having Thursday night spaghetti and meatballs for parents of SPED students or students that are, that have an IEP. What's something that they need to know? What are other resources outside of school that they can actually go to? What are some community supporters that they can actually go to? So that was really helpful in doing that two-part, doing it for the staff members and also doing it for families as well. And that was a way that we were able, because if you introduce a restorative process to a parent and it's a responsive measure, they still look at it as punitive. Like, you didn't tell me in advance. Like, you didn't tell me what I was getting into before I got into it. And you're telling me because my child has gotten into some level of conflict. So is it really a responsive practice or equitable practice at that point? So how do we introduce this practice to families prior to their child or scholar being involved in an incident that may require a restorative process? So really introducing it before any clear harm has taken place, I think is the most effective way. And allowing them to really ask questions. And so how do you build your back to school night? Any type of, family engagement activities, how are you building those practices in so that they're aware, and then that you can name it for them, after they've experienced the process. So that's been really helpful in my practice. Leanne's question, you mentioned people saying in the survey that they won't do it. In the survey, is the survey a part of your resource mapping? We use the Readiness Assessment. How ready is your staff to welcome this particular initiative? And I think that it's important on a couple different ways. And I think when we look at readiness assessment, we look at like the eagerness of walking into this new thing. But oftentimes when we think about readiness, we also have to think about capacity. Does my staff have the capacity to take on this new initiative? And the survey will allow, and if you tap into implementation science, and you go through like the 5 stages, and I'm probably gonna jack this up, but when you look into like the laggards, which are the people that are kind of inquisitive, they're pretty vocal, and they'll probably bash any initiative that comes their way. Those are probably the most influential people in the building. The people that's most resistant, hey, I've been in this school for 30 years, I'm doing it my way, I've been successful. Like, those are not the people that you focus on, because you're not going to move them by words, you're going to move them by action and evidence. Educators have a fine way of if you want to introduce something, show me the data. But when they present to students, they say, do as I say, not as I do. So we're operating off of 2 different value systems, right? Maybe that's just my experience. I'm just speaking from my experience. But when you look at that information, and a lot of times we do implementation, we try to focus on the people that's the most restrictive. Those people aren't really going to move. It's going to take a lot for them to move. What you do is you really dive into the people that question everything that you're doing, because that actually builds capacity, because that's engagement. So when we look at engagement, we talk about, especially like with virtual learning, the people that ask a lot of questions are engaged, even though they might be bashing what you're doing. Their engagement is allowing more curiosity. And if you spark their curiosity a little bit more, you're going to have them buy in a little bit more to whatever the process is. And so what they're really saying is, I need you to make this make sense to me before I approve of the message. And so if you're questioning what I'm doing, I'm embracing their engagement. So I don't worry about the people that's disengaged. It's like, you know what, I'm not doing that regardless of what you're talking about. I actually leverage the people that are actually doing it so they could be the messengers, because we know teachers and educators like data, right? They like, has somebody else done it and give me the information that they've done it and done it well. So you use the people that's highly motivated to actually pull in the people that are curious and bashing what you're doing, because the internal folks, so the lateral, so what I mean by lateral, like, this isn't like a leadership down, like that doesn't work. Like, you're not that powerful. Like, leadership, we just gotta like cut that out a little bit. Like, you're not that powerful that when you speak, they do. No, these are human beings, and they have their own opinions. But what you do is you leverage the people that are the early adapters. The early adapters are like, hey, this sounds good, I'm jumping on it. The early adapters actually bring in the laggards that actually move the exile people a little bit closer. So if you move the exile people into laggards, you're actually moving the crowd, because you're sustaining the early adapters. What ends up happening is when we adjust to the exile people and don't embrace the early adapters, we actually lose the early adapters and they fall into a laggard position. So embracing the people that are actually really gung-ho about the initiative and really want to dive in, like, even if it's 7, you got data for 7 people. You don't need data for 60, you need data for 7. And the 7 is going to move it to 15, 15 going to move it to 30. And so we just got to build it as we go and understand, this is a multi-year process and not a one-hitter quitter. And we're not looking for schools to be restorative schools in 1 year. So that's really the key. And I think that kind of supported somebody else's question. Maybe not.
No,
Oh,
it
so
did.
survey.
Dan's other question.
Yeah, the survey. I think I touched on it before, but I definitely think a readiness assessment before any information is given will just give you enough information to really direct your communication to your staff. So it's not about necessarily how many people we have that are early adapters, but it can be a really good indicator to let you know, how do I communicate moving forward?
Thank you so much, Yazid. Does anyone else have a question that they didn't put in the chat that we want to try and squeeze in before we move on to some other rounds? Go ahead, Zakia.
I just want to know what exit you're from, Yazid.
Exit 9.
So am I. I went to Franklin High School. I'm from Somerset.
My mom lived in Somerset. I'm born and raised in New Brunswick.
My mom taught in New Brunswick at Lord Sterling for years.
I went to Lord Sterling.
How old are you? I'm so sorry, y'all. How old are you?
38.
Okay. You might have had her. We'll have to talk offline.
Okay. Yep, I went to Lord Sterling. That was I lived in the new apartments, which was like right below Lord Sterling. Yep.
Yep.
The Jersey contingent is bold tonight. Way to show up, folks. All right. I would love to do a round about what we're taking away from our conversation with Yazid. I think what I'm taking away is that this work requires commitment and careful consideration from front end to back end, and that that the work has to start with the grown-ups doing the work ourselves. So with that, I will pass to Yazid with humor.
What I'm really taking away is that our circle is getting wider and bigger, and that is that's really giving me joy. This work is difficult, but it's one of the fundamental assumptions. What we need is already here, in our core assumptions, and you all have the gifts, the tools, to really do this work and really create a ripple effect in the work that you're doing. And I'm learning that the commitment is actually already here. We just need more structure to keep the fire going with the commitment. And let me see what I'm passing. Don't tell me. Hold on. I think Alita, but don't quote me. Yeah, and I'm with enthusiasm, I'm passing the talking piece to Alita.
All righty. I think what's being reinforced today is that restorative justice, this is a journey and not a race. And the importance of connecting this to a bigger picture. And some of the pieces to that, of course, is, you know, the equity, the self-reflection as educators, the importance of, you know, models, because all of this is, to me, it's a lot bigger than just practices, and that's what's being reinforced today. And so, particularly about the models that we serve and our place as educators, and we bring ourselves to the table, and how that can really empower and impact the lives of students in so many different ways. So it's so much bigger than restorative justice. So connecting it to all those different pieces. So with excitement, I pass to Sabrina.
For me, one of the biggest things with him, he was talking about, you know, doing the work with the adults. And I think especially as a student, I can totally understand where it's like students can question what's going on, or when we feel like our teachers and the people in our school, like the adults in our school, are not even following what they're teaching us. So that was one of the biggest things. Okay, so with patience, I'll pass to Zakia.
The two things for me, I think, One is grace with the process, because I like things done like right now, get up and going. So grace to know that it's not, as he was talking about, it's always gonna be evolving. There's never gonna be kind of like a finish line. It's gonna be a continuous thing. So getting that in my mind, because of my perfectionism issues and wanting it up. And also the intention part. So I feel like grace is the ship, and while it's always going, but the intention keeps us going in the right direction, because they have to be intentional. That helps us to not get stagnated. And so if we have those two pieces together, the intention, which keeps us moving forward, and the grace to allow it to evolve as it needs to and give space to bring others on, we'll be in a good space. So with grace, I pass to Jennifer.
For me, I'm kind of echoing both what Kimiko and Alita mentioned, that this is a journey. Aside from that, just really taking more on a focus on the adult aspect and factor in this whole picture of how we implement, and just the word dedicating to adults stuck to me, because a lot of the times, you know, if we can get the adults to do as they say, the students are easier going to receive and join along, and the culture of the school would begin to drastically change. So with resilience, I pass it on to Lydia.
Thank you. Okay, so that was a lot of information, so thank you so much. And two things sort of struck me, and it gave me a little bit more hope. And it talked a bit about the sustainability of the overall culture. When you implement this work into a system, you attach to the things that they're already doing. You don't come in there and try to recreate the wheel. So that made sense to me about sort of strengthening what they already do there with this approach. And the other thing is just a little bit more personal. I really appreciate your passion for this work, and your delivery and your commitment is evident and obvious when you talk about it, and you're very knowledgeable in it. And with having done this for at least 14 years and gone from school to school, it's very impressive that you remain passionate and focused on this work. So I commend that, and I thank you for being here tonight.
I think I'm up. This will make more sense in a minute, but I'm amazed how well Yazid set up the closing without having any idea what I was going to go with. But I had a real appreciation for that constant self-reflection and evaluation on the program, and making it data driven and saying, all right, well, show me how it's working, show me how it's working. You're doing this, great, what's it doing, and I think that's so critical with implementing anything, is just to constantly keep asking, how's it working, what's it doing. So I really appreciated that as a critical measure. And so with open-mindedness, I pass to Leanne.
Yeah, I think one of my key takeaways tonight was that it's not about just doing the practices, and how much it really isn't about just doing the practices. And I also, the whole business about it being a journey, and you make a plan and you adjust and you are flexible and you change and you keep planning. Those are my two takeaways. And I will pass with humility to Laurel.
Laurel went to another meeting.
Yasmina then.
Thank you, Leanne. Sorry I came late, guys. I had another meeting at the same time. But what I'm going to take with me is kind of what Sabrina said, that students really are a lot more perceptive than adults may perceive. So I think one thing we really have to work on is how the adults are presenting the restorative justice, because it's really easy as a student to tell when an adult isn't fully into something. Like if they're teaching a unit and they don't really care, it's so evident, rather than a unit they're passionate about. And I also wanted to just comment, like, Yazid, the story you told about like having your first teacher who was also Black, that I connected so much to that. And I kind of hate the fact that it's like a universal experience for students of color. But with bravery, I'll pass to Siobhan.
Thank you, Yasmina. I too was in the meeting with Yasmina. She is actually being rather humble. She's leading a group of teens remarkably. So I apologize. I wish I had been here earlier, but I can tell you from the second half of this meeting, two things. One, I want to come hang out with you and spend some time. And two, the creative way in which you engaged your teachers. That to me was like, wow, did not think in that direction at all, but boy, that was powerful. So with energy, I pass to Kamiko.
Thank you, everyone. So our next question is about the strengths, assets, resources, opportunities